Speaking of liberty, the National Broadcasting Company takes pleasure in presenting the second in another series of programs under the auspices of the Council for Democracy. Once again, we have a period of free talk on the air, and once again our host is Rex Stout, whom most of you already know as the author of baffling mystery stories featuring the solutions of that corpulent criminologist extraordinary, Nero Volpe. On these programs, you will come to know Rex Stout even better as an outspoken champion of our American democracy. We present Mr. Stout.
Thank you, George Putnam. Good evening, friends of liberty. I hope a certain man in Milwaukee is listening in, and a certain woman in Maysville, Kentucky, as well as a lot of other people in various places who, during the past year, have met some argument or statement of mine by quoting from a book. Not just any book, a particular book called Road to War, written by Walter Millis of the editorial staff of the New York Herald Tribune. And I hope all these people are listening, because here is Walter Millis himself, our guest today. Won't you please issue an edict, Mr. Millis, prohibiting people from quoting your book at me?
I'm afraid that can't be done in a democracy, Mr. Stout. The best I can do is to promise not to quote it at you myself.
Well, that's a help anyhow. By the way, when was it published? 1936?
1935. Long before I had any idea what the world was going to look like today. All I can say is that when I wrote it, I was simply trying to tell the story, as I saw it, of just how the United States actually got into the last war.
Yes, and you were rather critical about it, weren't you?
I was. I put a lot of emphasis on the influence of British propaganda and the bankers' loans and the economic pressure of the war supply business. I also thought there was a lot of hasty emotionalism in the people and a lot of short-sightedness and blundering in the diplomacy of Wilson and House.
That's it. People are always telling me that Road to War shows how badly the people of the United States were fooled last time, and that they're not going to be fooled the same way again.
Don't I know it? I hear the same thing myself. People say that the country is back on the same old road to war. It traveled from 1914 to 1917, and that the book tells all about it. Unfortunately, it seems to have become almost a Bible for the groups that believe in peace at any price.
Well, you're not a peace at any pricer yourself.
I certainly am not. I believe deeply that a bold policy is the only safe policy for the United States today.
Well, that's not a quotation from your book. There's nothing like that in your Road to War.
Well, it's in the same war. In my book, I was writing about events that took place 25 years ago. Unfortunately, we are now living in the present. It would be very nice if we could just turn back the clock a quarter of a century and then save ourselves by simply doing differently all the fool things we did then, but we can't. You know what they say about the generals who always prepare to fight the last war instead of the coming one? Well, it seems to me that many people are trying so desperately hard to stay out of the last war that they never really look at the actual crisis presented by this one.
Maybe, Mr. Millis, but in a way you can't blame them. There's the same great struggle between the British Empire and German militarism, the same issue of the freedom of the seas for the United States, many of the identical problems that Woodrow Wilson had to struggle with.
It's the same, Mr. Stout, with a lot of big differences. For one thing, it's 25 years worse. A great deal has happened. A great deal has been done in those disastrous 25 years, which now can never be undone. For example, it might have been possible, if the United States had used its influence more wisely, to secure that peace without victory for which Mr. Wilson hoped in 1916. If that had happened, I thought, and I still think, that the world would be a far happier place than it is today. And that was the main reason why I was so critical of the course the country actually did follow. But once this country had entered the war, there was no further possibility of a peace without victory. There was no possibility of it in 1918. There is infinitely less possibility of it today. And it's no use talking as if such a thing were possible.
In other words, because you thought the country should have worked for a negotiated peace in 1916, it doesn't follow that you think it ought to work for a negotiated peace today.
Exactly, Mr. Stout. 25 years of passion, bitterness, bloodshed, and breakdown of our political and social order have altered the whole situation profoundly. They have put any genuine peace without victory utterly beyond the question. And to work for one would simply mean that we would get something very different and immeasurably more disastrous.
Oh, I agree with you. But to get back to that book of yours, wherever I go, I'm always having it thrown at me that you say the United States was dragged into the last war by British propaganda, the international bankers, the munitions makers, and President Wilson's recklessness in trying to suppress submarines. Now we see a lot of the same sort of thing, especially submarines, again in the picture. So haven't you changed your opinions considerably?
I don't think so. I think that if I were to write Road to War over again now, I would write it in substantially the same way. Possibly I'd change the emphasis here and there. I might put more weight on the reality of the challenge, which the War of 1914 presented to the American national interest, and less weight on the cynical aspects of the process by which we got into it.
No, I'd say that was quite a material change of view.
I don't think so, but I'll leave it to you to say. Frankly, I don't much care. I'm not going to pretend that I haven't learned a lot in the last few years, just as everyone else has. My trouble is that so many people seem to have found things in the book that I never knew were there myself.
Oh, sure, all writers have that experience, and it's very irritating. In your case, what things? Give an example.
Well, I never thought, and I don't believe I ever said, that the United States was dragged into war by anything or anybody. I believed, rather, that it had blundered into it, without knowing clearly what it was doing.
And you don't believe that we're blundering this time?
Certainly not to the same extent. When people say we are traveling down the same old road to war again, it seems to me that they are simply incapable of seeing the facts before their eyes. It's possible that war may lie ahead of us once more. But if so, we are not approaching it by the same hesitating, fumbling road. My book applied to 1914, but it most certainly does not apply to 1941.
Then would you say that many of the specific mistakes which you criticized in our policy last time have been avoided so far in the present crisis?
Well, there have been no private war loans. No one can possibly say that the greed of the private war supply business is hurrying us into the conflict. The Roosevelt administration hasn't got itself entangled in an unforeseen controversy about submarines as Wilson did. The public this time has not been carried away by hasty emotionalism over casual incidents. There have been worse incidents and more horrible outrages by far than in 1914-17, and if anything, the public has been almost too apathetic. But after all, that's a matter of opinion. It doesn't make any difference. What was or wasn't done last time doesn't make any difference. And what you or I said about it, and whether we were right or wrong, makes even less. There's only one thing that matters now, and that is the actual situation, now before the United States and before the world.
And that matters plenty. As you say, it's all that does matter. You don't believe it possible, Mr. Mills, to think about 1941 in terms of 1915 and 1916. Isn't that it?
It is. And I don't believe anyone really does look at this as a mere repetition of 1914, no matter how much you may talk that way. As I see it, what the United States was suddenly confronted with in August of 1914 was a kind of European family quarrel or civil war. What we are facing now, a quarter of a century afterwards, is a vast moral, political, and social revolution. We might conceivably have stayed out of the first. Whether or not it comes to a declared war, we cannot possibly dodge the second or its consequences.
What do you mean by the difference between a civil war and a revolution? I wish you'd explain that a little more.
Surely. The statesmen on both sides in 1914 were much the same sort of people. They came from the same sort of background, and broadly speaking, they had the same moral and cultural standards. And they didn't think they were beginning a long war. Each side hoped to arrange matters so that it would achieve a more dominant or more secure position in the world. But they thought that the world after the war would be essentially the same kind of world it had been before.
And they were wrong.
They were terribly wrong. The dislocation and bitterness and hatred were too much. The 20 years following the Treaty of Versailles were 20 years of progressive breakdown, until finally Hitlerism, building itself around all the worst elements in that history, arose as a deliberate revolution against world society. Its methods were admittedly those of lies and treachery, violence and oppression. It made war the central institution of the state and conquest its only end. It deliberately challenged not merely the geographical boundary lines of the European system, but much more important, the whole system of ideas, of laws, of standards, and of convictions by which the peoples of the world had been slowly and painfully learning to live and work and trade together.
And that seems to you a very different sort of challenge from the one the world faced in 1914?
Different in degree, Mr. Stout, and profoundly different in kind. In a direct physical sense, it is a far more dangerous menace to the United States. A Hitler Europe, with a new weapon of the airplane, with its colossal naval and industrial strength, and its manpower, could unquestionably undertake an invasion of the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately of the United States, as even a victorious Hohenzollern Germany could never have dreamed of doing.
But granting that, Mr. Millis, there is more to it than the military threat, isn't there?
Very much more. The economic stranglehold with which a Hitler Europe could grip American trade and industry and living standards is hard to picture now. Back in 1939, it was so hard to picture what the situation would be like if France should fall that we in this country hardly troubled our heads about the possibility. Then suddenly France did fall, and we were appalled by what resulted. But that was not one-tenth so appalling as the purely economic problem would be if Britain and Russia should go down and the United States should face, alone, a Hitlerism master of the entire outer world.
Well, certainly the military and economic threats are much greater for us now than they were last time. But you also said you thought the menace was different in kind as well as degree, didn't you?
Mr. Stout, to my mind, this thing carries within itself a kind of challenge of which we knew next to nothing a quarter of a century ago. It is a challenge to our standards, our ideas, our whole system of laws, the imponderables by which our society has lived. If a German airplane never crossed the Atlantic, if our foreign trade were never troubled, I still do not believe that American democracy could live for 5 years after a Nazi triumph in Europe. Can you imagine that we here in America would be tolerated by a master race which declared brutally and openly, and now I'm going to quote, "It is a matter of indifference to Germany if tens of thousands of Norwegian men, women, or children starve and freeze to death." Or, "The 1,500,000 Serbs who live within our borders must adapt themselves to new conditions or disappear." Or, "Our colonists are coming to fight the Polish peasantry without mercy. If God exists, he has chosen Adolf Hitler to chase this rabble out of here."
Enough, unquote. If you meant that for a question, Mr. Millis, I answer no. Such a self-styled master race tolerates no one but flunkies, and I can't quite see America inhabited by 130 million flunkies. No, I can't conceive of a master race tolerating a free America, and contrariwise, I doubt if free Americans will tolerate a master race.
Mr. Stout, we are standing at the climax of 25 years of war and violence and searching revolution. The past has been destroyed. The one question is, who is to build the future, we or they? The ape minds which are now spreading their barbarity through a continent, or men who still hold to some such concept of human life and welfare as we in this country have tried to live by? That is the question. We can't escape it. The future must come on the one basis or on the other. We and our children must live in it. It seems to me that there is no effort and no sacrifice on the part of the United States which will not be worthwhile if they help to shape that future to a tolerable end.
Yes, the future is all we have. The past is gone, and the present, this ugly and bitter day, this October 16th, 1941, belongs to Hitler's army. When and where we start the future depends on us. Thank you very much, Mr. Millis. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this afternoon has been Walter Millis of the editorial staff of the New York Herald Tribune and author of Road to War. This is Rex Stout saying goodbye until next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the second of another series of programs entitled Speaking of Liberty. These programs are brought to you each week by the National Broadcasting Company in cooperation with the Council for Democracy, a national organization dedicated to the propagation of an American faith in democracy. On next week's program, Rex Stout will bring to the microphone Margaret Leach, author of Reveille in Washington. By the way, a copy of the script of this broadcast will be mailed free of charge to anyone requesting it. Please address your letter or card to the Council for Democracy, 285 Madison Avenue, New York City. Please address your letter or card to the Council for Democracy, 285 Madison Avenue, New York City. Speaking of Liberty has been presented as a public service by NBC and the independent radio stations associated with the Red Network of the National Broadcasting Company, and has come to you this evening from the RCA Building, Radio City in New York.